Now we'll move on to Module 2, where we will cover identity synchronization and protecting those identities in the cloud. So let's get started.
Before you begin synchronizing your on-prem Active Directory to your Azure AD tenant, you'll need to clean up your ADDS to prepare for the directory synchronization. If you don't prepare, then you could cause failures that cause a lot of cleanup that you'll have to go through and take care of later. So if you have, for example, duplicate attributes or certain characters and attributes, then you could cause it to fail. So it's best to really align your attributes, go through the requirements, and ensure that you have these things in order. Before you start synchronizing your on-prem Active Directory, you can check and fix any issues that you might have with your accounts, and you can do this by using the ID Fix tool, which you can download directly from Microsoft. What it does is it scans your on-prem AD or the parts that you specify, and then identifies problem like formatting issues, duplicates, and such. And then you can fix these problems within the tool before you begin the synchronization. During your planning, some of the considerations you need to make are, do you require an Azure AD Connect failover scenario? You'll also want to think about the advanced configuration features and how you want to synchronize your Active Directories. Do you have multiple forests that you need to consider? And do you want to synchronize all of your object attributes or just use specific ones and use filters to pull those in? And do you want to synchronize all or only part of your Active Directory? So you do get a free Azure AD subscription with an M365 subscription. And when you set up the directory synchronization, you can install Azure AD Connect on one of your on-prem servers. So you'll need to verify your on-premises domain. And the Azure AD Connect wizard will actually help guide you through this. And then make sure that you've obtained your usernames and passwords for the administrator accounts for the M365 tenant and Active Directory domain services. When you go to plan your Azure AD Connect topologies, keep in mind that having multiple Azure AD Connect sync servers connected to the same Azure AD tenant is not supported unless it's a staging server. So it's unsupported even if these servers are configured to synchronize with a completely exclusive set of objects. Sometimes this topology is considered if you can't reach all of the domains in the forest from a single server, or if you want to distribute load across several servers. Azure AD Connect will allow you to install that second server in staging mode. And in this mode, the server is reading data from all of the connected directories, but does not write anything to connected directories. It uses the normal synchronization cycle, and so it keeps an updated copy of the identity data. Then if there does happen to be a disaster where the primary server fails, then you can fail over to the staging server. We do recommend having just a single tenant in Azure AD for an organization. While many organizations have environments with multiple on-prem Active Directory forests, and there are various reasons for doing so, such as designs with account resource forests or when there's a merger or acquisition. So when you have multiple forests, all forests must be reachable by a single Azure AD Connect sync server, and that server must be joined to a domain. If you need to, you could even place the server in a perimeter network or DMZ. When you go through the installation wizard for Azure AD Connect, you'll be given several options to consolidate users who are represented in multiple forests, with the goal being that the user is represented only once in Azure AD. If your environment does not have a default configuration where each user has only one enabled account, each user has only one mailbox, a linked mailbox for a user is not in a different forest, and such assumptions, then you may have to look at an alternate topology. There is actually a one-to-one relationship between an Azure AD Connect sync server and an Azure AD tenant. So you do need one Azure AD Connect sync server per installation. When you're planning for pass-through authentication with Azure AD, keep in mind that the user's password is validated against the on-prem Active Directory controller. The password does not need to be present in Azure AD in any form. This allows for on-prem policies, such as sign-in hour restrictions, to be evaluated during authentication to cloud services. The way that pass-through authentication works is by using a simple agent on a Windows Server domain-joined machine in the on-prem environment. The agent then listens for password validation requests and does not require any inbound ports to be open to the internet. In addition, you can also enable single sign-on for users on domain-joined machines. With single sign-on, these users only need to enter a username to help them securely access cloud resources, and they don't have to enter a password. So remember, with Azure AD Pass-Through Authentication, also called PTA, we ensure that users have a password validation for all the services that they rely on for Azure AD, and that's always performed against an on-prem Active Directory. Also, Azure AD Pass-Through Authentication is configured through the Azure AD Connect agent, and that's listening for those password validation requests. And finally, you need to remember that the server that runs the agent for pass-through authentication should be joined to the Active Directory domain where the users are located. An alternate type of synchronization called password hash synchronization is where hashes of user passwords are synchronized from on-prem to Azure AD. So when the passwords are changed or reset on-prem, the new password hashes then get synchronized to Azure AD immediately, so your users can always use the same password for cloud resources and on-prem resources. These passwords are never sent to Azure AD or stored in Azure AD in clear text. You can use PHS together with password write back to enable self-service password reset in Azure AD. Also, you can enable seamless SSO for users on domain-joined machines that are on your corporate network. Azure AD Connect also is providing an ongoing account synchronization all the time while it's checking for changes in Active Directory domain services in your on-prem environment, and then forwarding those changes to Azure AD. With PHS, you actually have the ability to filter which accounts are synchronized and whether or not to synchronize the hash version of user passwords. So keep in mind, this is the simplest way to enable authentication for ADDS identities in Azure AD. So before you go to install Azure AD Connect, there's a few things that you need. Some of the prerequisites you should have are an Azure AD tenant. So you need to add and verify the domain you plan to use in Azure AD. By default, an Azure AD tenant is going to allow 50,000 objects, but if you verify the domain, then that limit increases to 300,000 objects. And if you need more than that, then those can be taken care of through licensing such as Microsoft 365. Another prerequisite with your on-prem Active Directory is ensuring that the AD schema version and force functional level are at Windows Server 2003 at least. The domain controllers can actually run any version as long as the schema and forest level requirements are met. And again, that's at Windows Server 2003 or later. If you do want to use the password write-back feature, then your domain controllers must be on Windows Server 2012 or later. Those are some things to keep in mind around the prerequisites with your on-prem Active Directory environment. When looking at Azure AD Connect Server, this actually contains critical identity data, so it's important that we properly secure the server and administrative access to it. It should be treated as a Tier 0 component, and we recommend that you harden your Azure AD Connect server to decrease that attack surface area, since it is a very critical component of your IT environment. Some of the recommendations that will help mitigate security risks to your organization would be creating a dedicated account for all personnel with privileged access, denying use of NTLM authentication with the Azure AD Connect server, ensure that every machine has a unique local administrator password. You can look into the local administrative password solution to help configure random passwords on each of your servers and protect them by an access control list. Moving on to the SQL Server used by Azure AD Connect, you'll want to make sure that you have a server lined out for that. By default, SQL Server 2012 Express Local DB will be installed to store your identity data, but Azure AD Connect also supports versions of SQL Server from 2012 to 2019. And be sure you have the latest service pack installed. As far as accounts that you need for Azure AD Connect, you'll need to make sure you have an Azure AD Global Administrator account for the Azure AD tenant that you want to integrate with. If you use Express settings or upgrade from DirSync, then you must have an administrator account for your on-prem Active Directory. And that's an enterprise administrator account that's needed. If you use custom settings, then you'll have more options, so you can look into those if you go down that path. And when considering connectivity for Azure AD Connect, you'll need a DNS resolution for both intranet and internet to provide to the Azure AD Connect server. And that DNS server must be able to resolve names both to your on-prem Active Directory and to Azure AD. Also, if you have firewalls on your intranet, you'll need to open ports between Azure AD Connect and your domain controllers. So those are some of the prerequisites you'll need to keep in mind when configuring Azure AD Connect. When you go to set up Azure AD Connect, there are two installation types for brand new installations. There's Express and Customized. Express is the most common option and is used by the majority of organizations when they go to install Azure AD Connect. It was designed actually to provide a configuration that works for most common customer scenarios. The Express installation assumes that you have a single Active Directory forest on-prem. You have an enterprise administrator account you can use for the install, and less than 100,000 objects in your on-prem Active Directory exist. You'll also get the password hash synchronization for single sign-on and synchronization of all eligible objects into all domains and all OUs. The configuration will synchronize your users, groups, contacts, and Windows 10 computers. And automatic upgrade is enabled for Azure AD Connect to ensure that you're always using the latest available version. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the custom path does allow more options than the Express, And it should be used in all cases where the configuration that I just described doesn't work for your organization. So again, if you just have a single forest topology and want to use PHS for authentication, then the express settings work great and are the default option. Before you do choose to begin either install, you'll need to download the Azure AD Connect files and then go through all those prerequisite steps that we just talked about and that are listed in the documentation. Now let's touch on Azure Active Directory Connect Health. So the idea behind Azure AD Connect Health is to provide you with robust monitoring of your on-prem identity infrastructure. The goal of AAD Connect Health is to enable you to maintain a reliable connection between your on-prem and the cloud online services. So there are some key identity components that we're looking at monitoring, and then we bubble up those key data points about the components in an easily accessible way to you in the Azure AD Connect Health portal. You can use this portal to view alerts, performance monitoring, usage analytics, and other information. You'll have basically a single lens of health for your key identity components all in one place. So to summarize, the Azure AD Connect Health can give you a central location to view the health of key identity metrics for your on-prem environment, and it just requires a simple agent to be installed on the targeted servers. Now, there are several required management tasks that you should perform to make sure that your users synchronize efficiently and that there aren't any issues when you deploy Azure AD Connect. Some of these tasks include recovering from unsynchronized deletes, managing user accounts, even through enhanced user management, recovering user accounts that may have accidentally been deleted. So in this case, after you delete a user, the account remains in a suspended state for 30 days. And during that 30-day window, you can still restore the user account along with all its properties. But after that 30-day window passes, then the permanent deletion process is automatically started. You can view your restorable users, restore a deleted user, or even permanently delete a user in the Azure portal. When talking about the enhanced user management tasks, some of those include more visible user properties such as object ID, directory sync status, creation type, and identity issuer. The search function will allow you to look for substrings and combine a search of names, emails, and object IDs. And then there's also some enhanced filtering by user type, directory sync status, creation type, company name, and domain name. So we've really tried to make these management tasks for you as easy as possible because they are important. You can also manage groups as part of the directory synchronization to make sure that your environment and objects are where they need to be. So once you implement directory synchronization with AAD Connect, then you'll want to manage them in your Active Directory. Similar to the write back feature with users, there's also a write back feature for groups that writes Microsoft 360 groups from Azure AD to on-prem AD. And then the synchronized group from AAD to on-prem AD also include the group memberships if the user accounts are created in your Active Directory. During setup of Azure AD Connect, Azure AD Connect sync security groups such as AD Sync admins, AD Sync operators, AD Sync browse, AD Sync password set are all automatically created. And then you can use these groups to troubleshoot directory synchronization issues, or even assign a user temporary permission to run a manual synchronization. And all of these groups are created as local groups on domain joined servers or as domain groups when you install Azure AD Connect on a domain controller. We also have a capability around protecting your identities called Azure AD Identity Protection. So this is a tool that's going to allow you to accomplish 3 key tasks. The first of which is automate the detection and remediation of identity-based risks, then investigate risks using data in the portal, and thirdly, export this risk detection data to third-party utilities for further analysis. Identity protection is using the learnings that Microsoft has acquired through Azure AD, the consumer space with Microsoft accounts, and with Xbox gaming. So we're analyzing trillions of signals every day to identify and protect you from threats. The signals that are generated by and fed to identity protection can then be further fed into tools such as conditional access to help make access decisions, or be fed back into a SIEM, security information and event management tool, for further hunting and investigation based on your policies. There are 3 categories that identity protection uses for risk. The tiers are low, medium, and high. And while we don't provide specific details about how risk is calculated, what we do say is that each level brings higher confidence that the user or sign-in is compromised. For example, something like 1 instance of an unfamiliar sign-in property for a user is not as threatening as leaked credentials for another user. As mentioned, you can also export the risk data. So this can be done for archival or for investigation and correlation purposes. The Microsoft Graph has APIs that will allow you to collect this data for further processing. And then you can review and take action on detections as needed. And there are some reports that can even help you in your investigations that identity protection provides. Identity protection identifies risks in the following classifications. So stuff like atypical travel. So sign in from an atypical location based on the user's recent sign-ins. Password spray. This could indicate that multiple usernames are being attacked using common passwords in a brute force manner. And stuff like malware-linked IP address. So sign in from a malware-linked IP address. And leaked credentials indicating that a user's valid credentials have been leaked. And these risk signals and remediations can be used in conjunction with each other to notify or automate certain actions. So you can have the risk signals themselves trigger remediation efforts, such as requiring users to perform multi-factor authentication or reset their passwords using self-service password reset, or even blocking them until an administrator takes action. There's also vulnerabilities reported by Azure Identity Protection and the recommendations on how to address those. Some of the other ones that are mentioned up here are sign-ins from infected devices. So you can see how valuable this is in detecting vulnerabilities and risk events against your identities. Whenever you go to plan your investigation using Azure Identity Protection, then you can take these detections that are reported to you in these 3 key reports: risky users, risky sign-ins, and risky detections, and then take action on them as needed. You'll get access to information, and that helps you have a better understanding of the weak points in your identity security strategy. So again, these 3 reports are risky users, risky sign-ins, and risky detections. And all 3 of these key reports will let you download events in CSV format if you want to analyze further outside of Azure portal. The risky users and risky sign-ins reports will let you download the most recent 2,500 entries, while the risk detections report allows for downloading the most recent 5,000 records. And again, this uses the Microsoft Graph API integrations. So this is really useful when needing to aggregate the data with other sources from your organization. The reports do give you a lot of information on your risks, and then keep in mind some of the overall best practices for mitigations include excluding users who are likely to generate a lot of false positives, use a low threshold if your organization requires greater security, and exclude users who do not or cannot have multi-factor authentication. So now that we've covered identity protection and synchronization concepts, let's go take a look at a demo to implement identity synchronization. Okay, I'm done with the slides, so I have the demo left. How long has it been? 30 minutes? Okay. Okay, cool. So I think I'm shooting at a total of 45 to 60 minutes. So if my demo is about 15 to 20, well, I guess 15 to 30, then I'm good. Okay. Okay. Just gotta get it all. Okay, over here in our demo system, we're going to set up our organization for identity synchronization. So what we have is M365 deployed, and then we plan to implement identity synchronization between our M365 tenant accounts and local Active Directory accounts. So the first step in this is configuring the UPN suffix. So on the domain controller, I'm logged in as an administrator, and I've launched PowerShell as an administrator. And now I'm going to update the UPN suffix for the domain and on the UPN on every user in ADDS with my domain's unique UPN name. So to do this, I'm going to run the following command: set-adforest-identity, the domain name, -UPN suffixes at replace equals, and then in quotes my UPN name, and then in curly brackets. So I'll go ahead and type that command now. So I'm putting in my tenant name, in quotes, in curly brackets. So we have set-ad forest-identity, domain name, -upn suffixes, and our tenant name. Now I'll press enter to run the command. Okay, great. Now that one's done, and I'll run the next command. Get -ad user -filter. Okay, so I'll run the next command, get -ad user -filter *properties SAM account name pipe for each object, set AD user principal name, SAM account name, and the provider tenant name. So we're going to run that command now. Just a note, when I press enter on the command, something happened, and so that's all just, silence that can be edited out, but I'm just having to retype this last part and press enter again. All right, I'm just looking into why this errored out. We may just need to move on with the demo, but let me just see if it's a typo. Okay, I've corrected that script and I'm pressing enter again. So. Okay, great. Now that that command has run, then we just have one more command, which is to set the execution policy as unrestricted. And then enter A for yes to all. Okay, now let's move over to the Office portal to enable directory synchronization. So I've logged into portal.office.com as an administrator. And now I'll click on Admin to go to the M365 Admin Center, which I have opened here in this tab. Now I'm going to go to Active Users to take a look at directory synchronization. All right, once these loads, I'm going to click on these ellipses and directory synchronization. So here's where we can prepare Active Directory with the AD Connect tool, and this will allow us to download it. So by clicking on this, it will take us to the download page, allow us to download the Azure Active Directory Connect installation, which I've downloaded here in advance. And then we'll go ahead and run this to install it and get to the setup wizard. Okay, we're ready to run the setup wizard. So first, let's agree to the license terms, and I'll click continue. In this case, I'm going to use Express settings, and remember that Express settings do work for the majority of organizations, especially if you only have a single forest on-prem to synchronize. And if you need to learn more about Express settings, then you can always click here and refer back to the documentation. So again, I'm going to choose to use Express settings. Okay, now that's gone through that first part of the installation of installing required components. Then we want to enter the administrative credentials, a global administrator for Azure AD. We'll enter the username and password for a global admin. I've clicked next and I'll wait for it to verify those credentials. Okay, looks like it was successful in verifying those credentials. And now we need to make sure that we have enterprise admin credentials to connect to our on-prem Active Directory environment, and then enter that username and password. Once you have your credentials in, then it's time to click Next. Okay, in this case, okay, I used the wrong credentials on this, so I will try again here. Okay, now that I have the correct credentials in, it's validating and moving on to the sign-in configuration. So in this case, I'm going to put a check mark and continue without matching all UPN suffixes to verified domains. Since this is just a test scenario, it's completely fine, but just keep in mind that users would not be able to sign in to Azure AD with on-prem credentials if the UPN suffix doesn't match a verified domain. All right, I'm clicking Next, letting it go through the configuration, and now we're going to go ahead and click Start the synchronization process when configuration completes, and click Install. So now that the Azure AD Connect configuration completed and is successful, then it started the synchronization process. Now keep in mind that we can log into the Azure or the Office 365 portal to verify the user accounts and make sure that the accounts from our local directory have been created. We can also do a test sign-on through the Azure portal. And then also remember the Active Directory recycle bin is not enabled for this forest, and this is something that we do recommend. And then also Azure Active Directory is configured to use some AD attributes such as the anchor attribute, and that's listed here and you can click on learn more if you want to have more information. So we'll click exit on the wizard now, and we will go ahead and go to the Office portal now to validate the results of the directory synchronization, and then also to license a user so we can see what that process looks like. So let's go to portal.office.com, which I've done here. We'll go to the Admin Center. So I'm pulling that up now. Active users. Wait for those to load. Okay, so now we should see many users that we've synchronized from the on-prem Active Directory to Azure AD. So I'll click refresh to see if others show up. Here we can see that we now have a lot of users that we've synchronized from our on-prem Active Directory. Now we also want to license a user. So in this case, I'll search for a user. Let's see if we can find Abby Parsons. I'm filtering on Abby. Great. Found Abby. Now to edit her license information, I'm going to select, click on Manage Product Licenses. So remember, Abby was a user that was only in the on-prem, the ADDS domain prior to the synchronization that we just ran. So we need to license her for the M365 or EMS licenses that we'd like to apply to her user account. So in this case, we can see Abby is not in the United States, she's in the United Kingdom, so we'll select her location in the drop-down menu. United Kingdom, and we'll give her the Enterprise Mobility Plus Security E5 license. Place a check mark next to that and click Save Changes. All right, once we save those changes, we'll just close the window. And so that's how you license a user that's been synchronized from on-prem, and also the entire process of synchronizing local users from an on-prem Active Directory domain services environment to an Azure AD environment, complete through licensing a user with an Enterprise Mobility and Security E5 license. So that ends our demonstration.
In Module 2, we discussed identity synchronization and protection topics, such as planning your directory synchronization, configuring and managing synchronized identities, and Azure AD identity protection. We'll now take a 10-minute break. We'll see everyone back here when we'll cover Module 3, Identity and Access Management.